Welcome back. We are on page 5 of our course of our hymnal, and we're working with what's called the feudal era. I hope you have that written down now in your notes. The feudal era of 1100 to 1485. The Normans, who of course invaded, the Normans brought more than their language to the island. They also brought a form of government, social order, and land tenure we call feudalism. I'd write down that word, feudalism. This is a vision of the natural and human world as a triangle or pyramid. So I would draw a little triangle on my notebook paper really quickly. I draw a little triangle. At the very top of the triangle, put the king. And below, in carefully graded steps, are, below the king, nobles. Write the word nobles. Then below the word nobles, write the word freemen. And then below that, write the word serfs. Serfs are the ones who work the ground. Okay? They're the ones who do the farming. Yet all social systems, back to your book, page 5, yet all social systems are more fluid than they appear from the outside, and the feudal era in England was a tempestuous time. Let's write down the word tempestuous. It simply means lots and lots of problems and fighting. Okay? In 1215, write the date down. In 1215, a group of nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. Let's go ahead and write that down. Magna Carta. This great charter limited the powers of the king, marks the beginning of parliamentary government in England. This is a monumental moment. The Magna Carta is the first time that we see the king having powers that are limited. Okay, back to our reading on page 5. Other kings faced more violent opposition from the nobles, and two of them, Edward II in 1327, Richard II in 1399, were disposed and assassinated. We also should point out the next part. The Black Death, a grim name for the plague, ravaged England in the 14th century and may have killed 1/3 of the population. Let's write this down. The Black Death, it's called plague. And notice that we're going to be working in the 14th century, the 1300s, and it may have killed 1/3 of the population. Whoa! A lot of people died. Drained by an interminable series of wars with France, which dragged out for more than 100 years, England was then torn by a brutal civil war from 1455 to 1485. Let's write that down. This will probably be on the exam as a date you got to know. The English Civil War, 1455 to 1485. Now, we in America, of course, have a civil war, don't we? But it only lasted 4 years. Take a look at the number of years this war lasts. And lots of people die. And lots of problems. Again, that word, tempestuous. At the end, I'm back on page 5. I'm again reading under the feudal era heading. At the end of England's bloody civil war, Henry VII came to the throne, and all of the forces that had shaped the island kingdom for 1,000 years came together in a newly unified state. This is an important one. By 1485, and the years following, Henry VII comes to the throne and unifies England. England was poised to participate in an incredible period of discovery and expansion. They had come, the conquerors, warriors and priests, the knights and serfs, the outlaws and the righteous, the men, the women, the children, and had settled an island that a glacier had sliced off the European continent. On that relatively small stretch of land, they created a country, a language, and a literature that was become one of the wonders of the world. The one thing I would write down there that maybe you find fascinating, especially if you're into science, is that England as a rock, right? Very small rock, by the way. Today, you can fly into Heathrow in London and you can rent a car and drive all the way across England in a day. Easy. Okay? That piece of land once was part of the mainland. Okay? And a large glacier, they believe, cut it in half It floated out to where it now sits, and the body of water in between we call the English Channel. If you want, you can write that down and Google this, because it's an interesting body of water. There are people who actually train their whole life to see if they can swim across the English Channel. It is a far distance, it's a pretty good distance, but what makes it difficult to swim are the currents. You have lots of currents that can pull the person down. We've had people that tried to swim that English Channel who did not make it and in fact drowned to death trying to do it. It's a very dangerous body of water. It will of course be one of the famous bodies of water at the end of the European part of the Second World War, and of course the famous D-Day landing will happen as well with that body of water right there. All right, let's keep going. Some key historical theme information. From many tribes to one nation. Let's look at it, the bullet point on page 5. We want to write this in our notes in our own language. By the way, you are not, to take these notes, you are not rewriting the book. The book is written for you. What you want to do is to read the material and then put it in your own words. Does that make sense? So that, for example, as you get ready for the exam, you're capable of understanding some basic concepts or ideas. And obviously your annotations, we are now working only at level 1 in our annotations, aren't we? We're just bullet pointing the information that we're working with at level 1. What does this text say, right? We're reviewing that basic information. Notice 3 bullet points here. For a millennium, England experienced successive waves of invasion. Number 2, the last invaders, the Normans, brought with them the French language and feudalism. Number 3, after a turbulent period, England eventually became a unified state with one language. Let's go ahead and turn the page. We're now on page 6, and we're going to look at some essential questions across time, the Old English and medieval periods. Again, notice your dates. And our first question, we want to write this question down. What is the relationship between literature and place? We sometimes, by the way, will call this, what is the relationship between text and geography? Literature and place. Let's go ahead and read now. You're reading with me on page 6. Again, try and practice the reading, staying up with the reading. In 1399, just before he was disposed and killed, King Richard II returned to England from Ireland. In Shakespeare's version of the scene, the king kneels, touches the sacred soil of England and says, quote, "Dear earth, I do salute thee with my hand, so weeping, smiling, greet I thee, my earth," end quote. This is almost 1,000 years after the invading Anglo-Saxons and Jutes set foot on the island soil, but they neither knelt nor wept. Shakespeare's tragic king, whose feeling for the soil of England is so powerful, shows how the people had shaped a country that had in turn shaped them. I would go back and look at that line one more time. People had shaped a country that had in turn shaped them. Question. How did English writers respond to their island geography? Now, living in Wyoming, especially here in our part of Wyoming, writers and artists are often going to reference the mountains, right? They'll write about the mountains. They'll talk about the mountains. The mountains will be an inspiration for them of some kind, right? Because it's close to where they live. If you are a writer in England, and I would definitely write this down, it's an important idea for the rest of our Senior A study. If you are an English artist or an English writer, you are most influenced by the ocean, the sea. Why? Because it surrounds you, right? It determines all of the weather patterns, for example. It has a lot to do, of course, with occupations. Lots and lots of people spend lots of time out on boats on that water, right? Of course, there's going to be the whole issue of war as well, won't there? And the invasions were only the first of the kinds of wars that England will deal with. The placeless sea. Let's go ahead and keep reading on page 6. The creation of a sense of place is an important theme in the literature of those who came from elsewhere to dwell on the island. In a way, however, this work of creation begins with an awareness of what is the opposite of place. For islanders, that means the sea, both a protective barrier and an untamable threat. As a watery wilderness, the sea is a kind of placeless place, a vast nowhere that can separate one from home. Let's make a couple of observations under this heading. 1. The ocean, the sea, for the people of England can be seen first as security. Security. To get to England, you have to get in a boat and you have to come to the island. Which means that if you are going to bring thousands and thousands of troops to England, the only way they're getting there is in a ship. That's the only way. There's no bridge that can be made from the mainland continent to the island. And so the only way you're going to ever get invaded is to have large numbers of ships show up. So all you have to do is to place watchmen all the way around England, right? And be able to see the boats coming, and then you can quickly bring your own soldiers there to defend yourself. Do you got me? Okay? Number two, the sea is also not only security, but it is a threat. It is hard to get off this island and go anywhere. Of course, you have to be in a boat, and it's dangerous. The minute you get in a ship and you start sailing, bad things can happen. Of course, they say, psychologists say, that one of the worst imagined death is death by drowning. And of course, the fear of possibly shipwreck means you could drown. So there are a lot of people, and we'll want to put this in our notes, there are a lot of people who live and die who never leave England. They never leave that rock. They literally live and die, and they never leave it. They never go across the English Channel to other parts of Europe, and they just live there their whole life. Later, we'll see poets who lived most of their life in England and then finally will leave. We'll think especially, you can put this in your notes, John Keats, the great romantic poet, who will get tuberculosis, bad attack of the lungs, and will leave England to go and try and solve his problem, and he will for the first time leave England and head to Rome, where ultimately, tragically, he dies. Let's look at the next heading, the seafarer and the wanderer. What does it mean that there's quotation marks around those two titles? Right, it means that it's a title. We're going to see this here in a few moments when we start reading from our textbook these two titles from the Exeter book. Two Anglo-Saxon poems, chilled by images of the sea, The Seafarer and the Wanderer, are spoken by men on sea voyages. They tell of exile and separation from a remembered home. The bleakness of these poems of lonely struggle is, however, tempered by a different frame of values. Resigned and even bitter as they must have been in their original forms, these poems have come down to us in copies made by monks. Monks were aware that Christianity itself begins with the story of exile. Adam and Eve banished from the Garden of Eden. In the Christian tradition, all exile is a model of the exile of humankind from its rightful place in heaven. In editing The Seafarer, monks therefore framed the sea-tossed speaker's lament for his life with the overarching Christian theme of exile from Eden, from heaven and from God. So let's write down in this brief section that we're going to find that exile, or being away from your home, is going to be one of the major themes of a lot of the literature that we're about to study. The Sea Road. Let's look at the next one. The sea also figures in the first epic poem of British literature, Beowulf, which contains a distant echo of the journey of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes to England. In this poem, the hero Beowulf and his men travel by ship to the land of the Danes to face the monster Grendel. The sea road, as it is called in the poem, is not merely a threatening watery waste. It's a road to fame and honor and a natural place for these seafaring warriors. Let's write down really quickly from this section simply two things. One of the most important epic poems in the history of the world is the first, to our understanding, the first epic poem in English language and in English history called Beowulf. Beowulf. We'll be studying this poem in detail later, okay? This is a poem about some men, warriors, who travel through the sea road, the ocean, and arrive at the land of the Danes to gain honor through battling a monster named Grendel. We'll have much to say about Grendel later. The Mead Hall, by the way, mead is another word for beer or alcohol. The Mead Hall, the destination for Beowulf and his men, is not a nation in our modern sense. It's a kingdom whose capital and command center is Heorot, a mead hall. That's like we would think of as a bar today, okay? A big gathering place, notice. A large building with a single room, kind of like a high school gymnasium. Probably smelled like a locker room, but it provided warmth, light, food, drink, song, and fellowship for a lord and his warriors. When the monster Grendel comes from the bleak and mysterious darkness to menace Heorot, he is striking at the very center of human society. the hearth around which people gather. This is why Beowulf must meet him there and drive him back into the swamp, the dark place from which he comes. Now, let's point out here that we'll get to Beowulf later, but let's point out that what they would do is they would build like a large gym. In the middle of the gym, they had a fire pit. On one end of the gym building, Mead Hall, they would have where the king would sit. Then all the way around the rest of the gym floor area was where all the soldiers or the thanes slept. Okay, that's kind of where they camped out. So the point made here is probably these mead halls stunk to high heavens. We know that they did not drink often their beer from, or their mead from glasses, but actually drank them from large bowls that they would drink out of. For them to drink that much alcohol and still remain alive, they had to be large people. And we believe that these fighting warriors that we will call often as Vikings were pretty large men. They were tough. Now I'm looking on page 7. Do you see it? And you're going to want to make a special note in your notes in the purple. Do you see it there in the purple box? Let's read really quickly this one. The changing English language and the beginnings of English. We're going to have much more to say about this in future lectures, but let's talk about the English language and where it comes from. The rise of English as a planetary language is an unparalleled success story that began long ago in the middle of the 5th century AD. Several large tribes of sea rovers, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, invaded the islands then known as Britannia. They brought with them a Low Germanic tongue that in its new setting became Anglo-Saxon or Old English. The language came to be called English after England, the land of the Angles. Okay? So English, let's write it down in our notes, is a language that comes from these Germanic invaders, and ultimately it's a language that is named after the country England, or the land of the Angles. Okay? Back to the text, the second paragraph. Old English differs so much from modern English that it's harder for us to learn than German is. Still, we can recognize a number of Anglo-Saxon words. Notice bed, candle, earth, water. You'll notice, do you see it? The spelling is different, but the words are all there. Anglo-Saxon words such as these concern the unchanging basics of life. They survive later social upheavals nearly unchanged. A dramatic evolution, last paragraph, a dramatic evolution in the language came after yet another conquest of England, this one by the Norman French. These Normans, you'll remember the 1066 date from earlier, these Normans, shortened from Northmen, had originally been Vikings, but they now spoke French and had taken to French customs. In 1066, under William, Duke of Normandy, the Normans invaded England. One result was the Old English was flooded by the French spoken by the Normans. Examples of French influence include the words like sir and madam, curtsy, as well as honor and royal. From this infusion of French words emerged a tongue that today we call Middle English. Let's write down 2 things really quickly about English and its development. 1, there are 3 stages to English as a language. 1 we call Old English. Here, write down simply the title Beowulf. 2, there is Middle English. This will be the language of the English of Chaucer. Write it down. Chaucer. Chaucer. We call this Middle English. Finally, we will speak of modern English as Shakespearean English. By the time we hit Shakespeare in roughly 1600, we are already looking at a language that we can be pretty familiar with. We don't need translation to read Romeo and Juliet, for example. All right, let's go now to page 8. How did literature, another question for you to write down. How did literature make a nation of an island? A place of shared stories. Let's keep reading. In the 8th century, a guy named Bede, B-E-D-E, a learned monk, wrote, quote, a history of the English church and people, making an important stage in England's developing sense of itself as an island nation. With his knowledge of Latin and history, Bede was not interested in merely telling the story of a single clan's Mead Hall. Instead, he wrote the history of an entire nation, Britain, formerly known as Albion. So Bede, let's write it down. Bede is significant for beginning to use the term Britain. Okay? Through Bede's informative prose, the reader can see how, quote, the island in the ocean, end quote, he describes with its abundant resources, is on its way to becoming the earth at which Shakespeare's Richard II will kneel. Most importantly, Bede is aware that his island is becoming a nation, a place that is as much a product of its history as of its geography. A country is a geographical area with shared stories. Let's jot that down. What makes a country a country? It is a group of people who have common stories. I would write that down. It is a group of people who have common stories. Okay? A nation, again, now the next heading, a nation created by imagination. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, England's greatest medieval poem, is all about shared stories and a sense of England as a nation of different social types. These various characters are on a pilgrimage to the town of Canterbury. There in 1170, Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered in the cathedral on the orders of his former friend, King Henry II, to whom he would not yield in matters of church policy. Becket was canonized or declared a saint, and the cathedral became a shrine. That is why the pilgrims are traveling there, and they will seal their fellowship by telling one another stories along the way. We will meet Chaucer in Canterbury Tales here in a bit, but just jot down in your notes really quickly that Chaucer is the greatest of our medieval writers, and he is, of course, the great representation of Middle English, as we'll refer to it. The other thing you can write down is that Chaucer is all about storytelling. Canterbury Tales, T-A-L-E-S, means stories. That's all it means. For Chaucer and his pilgrims, back to the reading, Canterbury is a somewhat distant goal, a symbol of the ultimate sacred place to which people journey on their life's pilgrimage, heaven. Such was the ideal. Chaucer's pilgrims, however, have a wide range of motives, desires, needs, many of which are far from noble. A later great poet and critic, John Dryden, was moved to say of Chaucer, quote, "He has taken